decided very early on that it would be an experience where you would have to move around the space and that there would be multiple ways of experiencing this work. You sort of become the editor of your own experience. The Rites of When is an evolution of certain ideas. I think in the past I've been perhaps concerned with documentation or framing of things that are existing in the world, whereas with this work I wanted to look to historical examples, but recreate and reimagine the idea of creating future rituals or future traditions. The work evolved in a structure that tries to mirror the extreme peak moments in an annual seasonal cycle. So the winter and the summer solstice, these moments of the longest day and the longest night. Our ancestors used to celebrate these moments, usually in communal way, so through carnival or festivals, maybe around the harvest or around a midwinter collective expression. I think that this commission really opened the door for an ambitious way of working, because the scale of this space really asks you to step up. The conversation about the commission first began in January 2020. I have to say, during that time, I actually found it really difficult to think about making art in that first year of the pandemic. And I ended up spending a lot more time outside of the city than I normally would. I've spent all my adult life in cities. I think this experience of spending time in a rural region, I became much more aware of the passing of the seasons. I noticed for the first time what an agricultural cycle looks like and how the landscape changes. This experience made me think a lot about how our changing climate is actually having impacts on us in many ways, including food production. The first time I entered the tank, I was really struck by the scale of the space, the way that sound just kind of lingers and sort of moves around in this space, and then the way that you can't see the edges of the room. This feeling of being in a space that was never intended for humans to inhabit, but at the same time it makes us feel like we're in some kind of forest or cathedral. You can see in the work that that's been an influence. The 7 screens in the work are placed and positioned and referencing the 7 sisters of the Pleiades, which are a significant star cluster for many cultures. Over time, they indicated the beginning or the end of the harvest season. There's a sun motif and a crescent moon, as well as these kind of mirrored square particles that are scattered throughout the work. The reference for these, for me, was a Bronze Age sculpture called the Nebra Sky Disk, and was considered one of the first calendars used for the calculation of the changing seasons. It's an image that could be of a celestial scene. Perhaps the particles represent stars in that night sky, or maybe they're scattered confetti after a large party. We start from a perspective that is way out in space, looking at our experience of the stars, and then we move closer to the Earth, where we have almost like a bird's eye view, where we're flying over the landscape. The landscapes are the only shots where we really see nature in the work, but they're actually landscapes that have been highly manipulated by human activity. So the forest is a plantation monoculture forest, so it's not very natural at all. The harvest that we see is harvesting on an industrial scale. I've been interested for a long time in the way that collectivity and energy is generated. We see groups of people engaging in communal activities that in the winter sequence come from existing historic types of carnival activities, like a procession and then a traditional circle dance. And then later on in the work, it's a more contemporary and slightly more abstracted idea of what those group activities could be. In the solstice sequence, where the colours shift from the warmth of a summer day to dusk, the emphasis was really on the idea of support, elevation, and who is being carried and who are the carriers. What follows that is a sequence which is actually based on a children's game used to generate the sound of a rainstorm. It's usually used in the context of school groups as a way of generating solidarity. But what was more interesting to me is this perhaps literal idea that it was the human hands that were generating the weather. So there was very specific types of music that I wanted in the work. Traditional folk music that has its origin in more kind of pastoral or rural settings. This very interesting polyphonic drone type sounds. What interested me about that music is that it's the kind of sound that has to be generated in a group. A single voice cannot create these sounds. I also worked very closely with Bob Scott, who's the sound designer on the project, and he brought his incredible expertise in how to work with the resonance of the space, spatialize the sound, and tie together the soundtrack across the 35 minutes of the work. I think I was really interested in an element of ritual that I see as something that is deeply human and necessary, that perhaps used to exist more within the framework of religion. But today I'm really interested in, from a secular perspective, how is that possible and how does it still exist? Because it's still really necessary. And so things like the final sequence, the climax of just being in a space, dancing, losing yourself in music amongst other people, this kind of abandon, it's a deeply human thing to need to do, I think. It really helps us forge bonds with each other, to kind of feel connected to other people through a shared experience. And I think we will always find ways to do that.